The darkest desires, sexual violence inside prison walls. Midnight falls over the correctional complex. The searchlights sweep across empty yards. The guard towers stand sentinel against a sleeping world. But within these walls, sleep is a luxury few can afford. Behind reinforced concrete, beyond the reach of moonlight, 10,000 souls lie awake. They calculate distances. They memorize footsteps. They measure the weight of shadows. This is not paranoia. This is survival. Tonight we enter a realm that exists in every prison, in every nation. Yet it remains invisible to those who've never worn a number instead of a name. A world where the human body becomes currency, where violence speaks louder than words, and where the distinction between punishment and torture vanishes in the darkness between bed checks. According to the most recent National Inmate Survey, the Bureau of Justice Statistics estimates 200,000 adults are sexually abused in American detention facilities each year. 200,000, more than the population of Salt Lake City, every single year. And these are only the reported cases, the ones brave enough to risk retaliation by speaking forbidden truths. But this is not a modern phenomenon. This shadow has followed incarceration through every age. It adapts its cruelty to each era's particular blindness. In the bowels of the Château d'If, the fortress prison immortalized by Dumas, historical records from the 1700s speak in coded language. They mention guards who demanded special compliance from prisoners. The Bastille's archives, seized during the Revolution of 1789, contained testimonies that French historians have only recently begun to decode. References to nocturnal visits and unnatural submissions. The prison administrators documented these not as crimes, but as disciplinary measures. When the first penitentiary opened in 1790 at Walnut Street in Philadelphia, the Quaker reformers believed isolation would inspire penitence. But Dr. Benjamin Rush inspected the facility in 1794. He wrote in his private journals about finding inmates in states of complete mental dissolution. They exhibited symptoms we now recognize as severe sexual trauma. His recommendations for reform were ignored for a century. Eastern State Penitentiary opened in 1829. It perfected the art of solitary confinement. Charles Dickens visited in 1842 and wrote that he found the psychological torture worse than any physical punishment. What he didn't write, what couldn't be published in his era, were the accounts from former guards. They testified decades later about the private arrangements between staff and the most vulnerable prisoners. Arrangements that flourished precisely because isolation meant no witnesses. The convict lease system dominated the American South from 1865 to 1928. It turned this violence into an industry. A 1908 investigation by the Georgia legislature found that at one prison camp, over 60% of female prisoners were pregnant. They were housed separately from male inmates. The investigators concluded that guards were responsible, but they recommended no prosecutions. The women's testimonies were deemed unreliable due to their criminal status. In 1913, Thomas Mott Osborne voluntarily spent a week in Auburn prison to understand conditions. His published account spoke of reforms needed. His private papers, discovered in 1974, described something else: a culture of sexual predation so pervasive that new inmates were claimed within hours of arrival. He wrote that speaking openly about it would make reform impossible. Society would rather close its eyes than confront such ugliness. The 20th century brought industrialization to incarceration, and with it, the industrialization of abuse. In 1970, the Arkansas prison scandal exposed by Thomas Merton revealed systematic torture at Tucker Prison Farm. Inmates were routinely subjected to sexual violence as part of official discipline. The federal investigation documented over 3,000 incidents in a single decade. 3 guards were transferred. None were prosecuted. Attica, 1971. After the uprising and massacre, the McKay Commission interviewed hundreds of survivors. Buried in their 1,000-page report are testimonies about sexual violence used as retaliation. Guards forcing inmates to perform acts on each other while watched. The systematic rape of prisoners suspected of leadership roles. These pages were classified for 20 years. In 1994, the Supreme Court case Farmer vs. Brennan finally established something critical. Prison officials could be held liable for failing to protect inmates from sexual assault. Dee Farmer, a transgender woman, had been raped repeatedly in federal prison. It took the highest court in the land to declare what should have been obvious. The Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment includes protection from sexual violence. But legal recognition did not mean practical protection. A 2001 Human Rights Watch report titled "No Escape Male Rape in U.S. Prisons" interviewed over 200 victims across 37 states. Their findings were devastating. Not only was sexual violence endemic, it was often facilitated by correctional staff who used it as a management tool. Troublesome inmates were deliberately placed with known predators. Protection was sold, not provided. The Prison Rape Elimination Act was signed in 2003. It mandated a zero-tolerance policy. President Bush stated that rape should never be part of the penalty for crime. Yet 20 years later, PREA's own data shows that reports of sexual violence have actually increased. Not because violence has increased, advocates argue, but because a fraction more victims now dare to speak. In 2018, the Bureau of Justice Statistics found that 24.1% of juvenile inmates reported sexual victimization, nearly 1 in 4 children. Half of these assaults were perpetrated by staff members, the very people charged with their rehabilitation. At the Circleville Juvenile Correctional Facility in Ohio, investigated in 2019, guards had operated a sex trafficking ring. They used juvenile inmates for over a decade. 34 staff members were implicated. 5 were convicted. Power in prison does not follow organizational charts. It flows through invisible hierarchies, written in fear and flesh. The 2012 National Former Prisoners Survey found that 86% of victims never reported their assault to authorities. They understood what researchers struggle to quantify. In this economy, speaking truth is more dangerous than enduring violence. The currency begins circulating the moment a new inmate arrives. A 2015 study by Dr. Nancy Wolfe at Rutgers University documented the first 72 hours as the most dangerous. Predators assess vulnerability with practiced eyes. They read body language. They test boundaries. They identify those without protection. The weak, the young, the mentally ill, the disabled, those without gang affiliation or family support. The hunting is methodical, almost professional in its precision. Guards participate in this economy through action and inaction. The 2014 investigation of Rikers Island found that corrections officers regularly placed vulnerable inmates in cells with known predators. This was punishment for minor infractions. They called it gladiator school. Between 2009 and 2013, there were over 1,000 documented sexual assaults at Rikers. The actual number, investigators admitted, was likely 10 times higher. Sexual violence in prison operates on multiple levels simultaneously. There is the immediate physical violation, but surrounding it, like concentric circles of trauma, spread wider violations: the destruction of identity, the erosion of will, the reprogramming of the mind to accept degradation as normal. Dr. Terry Coopers has interviewed thousands of prison rape survivors over 40 years. He describes a psychological phenomenon he calls learned helplessness behind bars. Victims stop resisting not because they accept the violence. Their minds literally cannot conceive of escape. The prison walls become internalized. Even after release, many survivors report feeling trapped in invisible cells. They wait for violence that never stops feeling imminent. A 2007 study in the American Journal of Public Health found that male survivors of prison sexual assault are 10 times more likely to attempt suicide than other inmates. For female survivors, the rate is 6 times higher, but these statistics only count those who make it to release. The Bureau of Justice Statistics doesn't track how many victims choose death over continued existence in these conditions. The psychological architecture of this trauma defies clinical categories. It is not merely PTSD, though that diagnosis captures some symptoms. Dr. Judith Herman pioneered the study of complex PTSD. She has written that prison sexual violence creates a unique form of psychological injury. Unlike single-incident trauma, it involves repeated violation within an inescapable environment by multiple perpetrators, often with the complicity of authority figures. The mind doesn't just break, it reconstructs itself around the breaking. James Gilligan, former director of mental health for Massachusetts prisons, documented how victims often become perpetrators, not out of inherent cruelty, but as a desperate attempt to reclaim agency. In his 25 years of observation, he found that over 70% of those who committed sexual violence in prison had themselves been victims. The cycle doesn't just continue, it multiplies. Silence surrounds prison sexual violence like a moat around a fortress. Multiple forces maintain this silence, each reinforcing the others. The National Prison Rape Elimination Commission, in its 2009 report, identified 5 levels of silencing. First, victims silence themselves. Reporting sexual assault in prison increases danger rather than decreasing it. A 2016 study found that 63% of those who reported sexual violence experienced retaliation. They were transferred to more dangerous facilities. They lost privileges. They faced disciplinary charges, or they were placed in solitary confinement for their protection. The cure became worse than the disease. Second, other inmates maintained silence through the convict code. Just Detention International documented that in men's facilities, anyone who reports sexual violence is labeled a snitch. They're marked for violence by the entire population. In women's facilities, reporters are ostracized. They're isolated from the social networks essential for survival. Third, staff silence reports through disbelief, minimization, or active suppression. The 2018 PREA audit of facilities nationwide found that 41% lacked proper reporting mechanisms. In many prisons, reporting sexual assault means telling the same guards who may be perpetrating or profiting from it. Fourth, administrators silence statistics through creative categorization. Many facilities classify sexual violence as consensual if no weapon was involved. They ignore the inherent coercion of the prison environment. Others categorize assaults as fights, disturbances, or unauthorized physical contact. The Mississippi Department of Corrections was investigated in 2020. They had reported 0 sexual assaults for 5 consecutive years at Parchman Farm. Federal investigators documented hundreds of cases at that facility. Fifth, society silences these stories through indifference. A 2019 public opinion survey by YouGov found that 54% of Americans believe prison rape is part of the punishment for crime. Media representations treat it as comedy. Politicians who advocate for prisoner protection face accusations of being soft on crime. We have collectively decided that those who break our laws forfeit the right to bodily autonomy. But occasionally, the silence breaks. The 2019 testimony of former inmate Michael Thompson before Congress described 14 years of sexual violence at Michigan facilities. His words were broadcast on C-SPAN to a nearly empty chamber. He detailed not just assault, but an entire economy. Protection sold by guards for $100 a month. Cells where rape was permitted in exchange for gang leaders maintaining order. Medical staff who refused to document injuries that would require investigation. The case of Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women in Alabama was exposed in 2014. It revealed systemic sexual abuse by guards spanning decades. The Department of Justice investigation found that officers forced women to perform sexual acts in exchange for basic necessities: toilet paper, tampons, phone calls to their children. One guard fathered children with 3 different inmates. He received 2 years probation. At Lowell Correctional Institution in Florida, the largest women's prison in the United States, a 2020 investigation found that guards had operated a prostitution ring. They used inmates for over 15 years. Female prisoners were sold to male guards from other facilities. Those who refused were placed in confinement. They lost good time credits, or they had drugs planted in their cells. 12 guards were indicted. The system that enabled them remains unchanged. These are not anomalies. They are patterns. The International Center for Prison Studies estimates that worldwide, 1 in 5 prisoners experiences sexual violence. In some countries, the rate approaches 1 in 2. From Brazil's Carandiru to Russia's Black Dolphin, from South Africa's Pollsmoor to Thailand's Bang Kwang. The methodologies of sexual violence transcend borders, languages, and legal systems. The cost of this global silence compounds generationally. Children of incarcerated parents show higher rates of sexual dysfunction. They struggle to form healthy relationships, and they show higher rates of perpetration of sexual violence themselves. A 2017 longitudinal study by Yale University traced the children of prison rape survivors for 30 years. 73% showed symptoms of secondary trauma. 42% reported sexual assault in their own lives. 28% were incarcerated themselves, often for sex-related crimes. Communities absorb thousands of survivors yearly. They're unprepared for the depth of their wounds. Dr. Melissa Hamilton's 2018 research found that areas with high concentrations of former inmates show increased rates of sexual violence. Not because former prisoners are inherently dangerous, but because untreated trauma metastasizes. Violence learned in cages doesn't remain caged. The economic cost for those who respond only to numbers is staggering. The National Prison Rape Elimination Commission calculated that sexual violence in prisons costs the United States $12 billion annually. Medical care, mental health treatment, lost productivity, and recidivism, $12 billion every year. The price we pay for pretending this problem doesn't exist, and yet solutions exist. Norway's Halden prison opened in 2010. It has reported 0 sexual assaults in 13 years of operation, not through harsh punishment, but through radical humanity. Guards trained in psychology rather than force. Architecture designed for dignity rather than degradation. A system that treats inmates as future neighbors rather than permanent enemies. Their recidivism rate is 20%. America's is 68%. But implementing such solutions requires acknowledging the problem. And acknowledgement requires seeing prisoners as human beings capable of suffering, deserving of protection, worthy of basic dignity. This is the step we refuse to take. The artist and former prisoner Jesse Crimes spent 6 years in federal prison. He created a massive mural using prison bedsheets and newspaper transfers, hidden from guards, smuggled out piece by piece. It depicts the divine comedy of incarceration. In one panel, bodies merge and separate in an endless cycle of violence and violation. He titled it Apocalyptean, Greek for uncovering what has been hidden. But we don't want to uncover what has been hidden. We built these walls not just to contain bodies, but to contain truths too terrible for polite consideration. We created these institutions to disappear problems, not solve them. And in that darkness we deliberately maintain, in that silence we collectively enforce, human beings suffer violations that would constitute war crimes if committed against enemy soldiers. But they are simply Tuesday in our correctional facilities. The French philosopher Michel Foucault wrote that the prison is the only place where power is exercised in its naked form, without justification, and where it justifies itself by its own existence. Sexual violence in prison is power in its most naked form, not power serving justice, but power serving itself, perpetuating itself, multiplying itself in the bodies and minds of those society has already condemned. Every night, as cities sleep peacefully, this violence continues. In California's Pelican Bay, where inmates in solitary confinement have reported guards facilitating assault as punishment for hunger strikes. In Louisiana's Angola, where a 2021 investigation found that HIV transmission through prison rape has created infection rates 5 times the national average. In Texas's Caulfield unit, where female guards were found to be trafficking male inmates for sexual services to outside clients. These are not failures of the system. This is the system. A system that uses sexual violence as a management tool, as a punishment multiplier, as a way to break spirits that bars alone cannot break. A system that counts on our discomfort with the subject to avoid scrutiny. A system that relies on our belief that some humans deserve whatever happens to them when we stop looking. But history teaches us that every hidden violence eventually comes to light. Every silenced scream eventually finds a voice. Every society that tolerates cruelty in its prisons eventually sees that cruelty escape its confines and poison its streets. The question is not whether we will confront this darkness. The question is whether we will confront it by choice or by catastrophe. Whether we will reform these institutions before they completely corrupt our claim to civilization, or after. In the pre-dawn hours, as guards change shifts and counts are conducted, 10,000 calculations continue. Who is safe? Who is dangerous? What must be traded for another day's survival? What pieces of the self can be sacrificed without losing everything? These calculations happen in our name, under our flag, with our tax dollars, inside institutions we created and maintain. We are not observers of this tragedy. We are authors of it. And every day we choose silence over action. We write another chapter in humanity's longest and darkest story. The walls have secrets, yes, but they are secrets only because we choose not to listen. The evidence fills filing cabinets, databases, and morgues. The survivors walk among us, carrying invisible wounds that will never fully heal. The perpetrators often wear badges. They collect pensions, and they retire with honor. And the cycle continues. Tonight, as you listen to these words in the safety of your home, someone is learning that their body is no longer their own. Someone is discovering that the sentence they received in court was only the beginning of their punishment. Someone is calculating whether death might be preferable to one more day in this economy of flesh and fear. This is the cost of our denial, not an abstract moral failing, but concrete human suffering multiplied by thousands, compounded by decades, transmitted through generations. We have built a machine that takes broken people and breaks them further, that takes violence and amplifies it, that takes human beings and teaches them they are something less. The prison industrial complex processes 2.3 million Americans at any given moment. Worldwide, 11 million human beings live behind bars. If even the most conservative estimates are accurate, over 2 million people currently incarcerated will experience sexual violence. 2 million. And we know this. We have always known this. And we do nothing. Cruelty repeats when we choose not to look, and we have chosen not to look for centuries. But the shadows we ignore don't disappear. They grow, they spread, they seep through the walls we build and poison the ground we stand on. The question that remains is whether we will continue to be a society that tolerates sexual violence as an unofficial part of criminal justice, or whether we will finally find the courage to illuminate these dark corners and demand true justice. Not just the performance of justice in courtrooms, but the practice of justice in cell blocks. Not just punishment for crime, but protection during punishment. Until we make that choice, the darkness persists, the violence continues, and the walls keep their terrible secrets. Paid for in currency, we pretend doesn't exist. In suffering, we choose not to see. In humanity, we've decided some people don't deserve. 2 million people tonight will sleep in these shadows. The question is whether we'll keep sleeping through their screams. If you want to understand the truths buried behind these walls, subscribe to Prison Diaries.